Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud, while stoned. In this video, we're going to start part 3 of Little Blue Book number 568, titled Darwin and the Theory of Evolution, and it is written by Carroll Lane Fenton. I'm not sure if there's a copyright date, but I had something in my beard there. No, there's not. There's not a copyright date. Okay, so we will pick up where we left off, and we are beginning Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is titled Darwin and the Gods. It is a strange thing that Darwin, whose work has exerted the most profound influence on religious thought, neither wrote or said much on the subject. This was true in spite of the fact that, like most thoughtful people, he had religion often in mind, and had definite ideas regarding it. Darwin saw himself as a scientist, and a scientist only. He felt wholly at sea in matters of technical philosophy and theology. Apparently, it did not occur to him that religion really had no need of high-sounding technicalities, and that a man could get quite as far by using common sense alone as by using common sense wrapped up in big words and hollow formula. He knew that he lacked specialized training in fields of abstract thought, and therefore he considered his views on religion as being of no real consequence to anyone but himself. That was a safe position, and perhaps a very just one, yet we are in no way obliged to adopt it, if for no other reason than to form a correct picture of the man. We should inquire as to his attitude on such subjects as God's revelation and technology. Oh, no, teleology. Probably there is no better way to conduct this inquiry than to trace, as well as we can, the development of Darwin's opinion from the time when he first began to analyze his beliefs to the time when he last stated it. Darwin began, as did most of us, by accepting literally the English Bible, placing a child's faith in an all-powerful and all-seeing God, who could create worlds or help small boys get to school on time, just as the occasion demanded. By the time he left Edinburgh, he had progressed far enough to question some things in the creed of the Church of England, and this caused some hesitation when his father urged him to go to Cambridge and become a preacher. But even then, he did not question a word of the Bible, so that when he found an admirably written book, which showed quite skillfully that the dogmas of the Church also were the everlasting truths of Christianity, his doubts were settled. That placid orthodoxy lasted almost throughout the Beagle voyage. The young man even got himself laughed at by the ship's officers for quoting the Bible as infallible evidence in argument. But the large number of things seen on the world trip could not fail to undermine orthodox faith, and particularly the orthodox faith of a young man fond of thinking things out for himself. Less than 3 years after his return to England, he had come to the conclusion that the Old Testament was no more reliable than the sacred books of the Hindus. That admission brought another flood of doubts, this time about the New Testament. If there was a God, interested in the good of the Hindus, would he make a new revelation and permit it to be linked up with the old Hindu gods and heroes, as the revelation of Jesus is connected with the Old Testament and its obvious falsehoods? Would the bearer of this new revelation believe in those ancient mythological characters? Such a condition was incredible, and so Christianity as well as Judaism went by the board. By further reflecting, says Darwin in his autobiography, that the clearest evidence would be requisite to make any sane man believe in the miracles by which Christianity is supported. and that the more we know of the fixed laws of nature, the more incredible do miracles become. That the men at that time were ignorant and credulous to the degree almost incomprehensible by us. That the Gospels cannot be proved to have been written simultaneously with the events. That they differ in many important details, far too important, as it seemed to me, to be admitted as the usual inaccuracies of eyewitnesses. By such reflections as these, which I give not as having the least novelty or value, but as they influence me, I gradually came to disbelieve in Christianity as a divine revelation. The fact that many false religions have spread over large portions of the earth like wildfire had some weight with me. But I was very unwilling to give up my belief. I feel sure of this, for I can well, turning of the page, for I can well not turn the page, apparently. There we go. For I can well remember often inventing daydreams of old letters between distinguished Romans, and manuscripts being discovered at Pompeii or elsewhere, which confirmed in the most striking manner all that was written in the Gospels. But I found it more and more difficult, with free scope given to my imagination, to invent evidence which would suffice to convince me. Thus disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate, but was at last complete. The rate was so slow that I felt no distress. Although I did not think much about the existence of a personal God until a considerably later period in my life, I will here give the vague conclusions to which I have been driven. The old argument from design and nature, as given by Paley, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. We can no longer argue that, for instance, the beautiful hinge of a bivalve shell must have been made by an intelligent being, like the hinge of a door by man. There seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course the wind blows. Darwin then admits, and even goes out of his way to prove, that pleasure exceeds suffering in the living world, yet he does not underestimate the role of pain in life. His objection is to a theological interpretation of the universality of suffering. Some, he says, have attempted to explain this with reference to man by imagining that he serves for his moral improvement. But the number of men in the world is as nothing compared with that of all other sentient beings, and they often suffer greatly without any moral improvement. This very old argument from the existence of suffering against the existence of an intelligent first cause seems to me a strong one, whereas, as just remarked, the presence of much suffering agrees well with the view that all organic beings have been developed through variation and natural selection. At the present day, the most usual argument for the existence of an intelligent God is drawn from the deep inward conviction and feelings which are experienced by most persons. Formerly, I was led by feelings such as those just referred to, although I do not think that the religious sentiment was ever strongly developed in me, to the firm conviction of the existence of God and the immortality of the soul. This argument would be a valid one if all men of all races had the same inward conviction of the existence of one God. But we know that this is very far from being the case. Therefore, I cannot see that such inward convictions and feelings are of any weight as evidence of what really exists. The state of mind which grand scenes formerly excited in me and which was intimately connected with a belief in God, did not essentially differ from that which is often called the sense of sublimity. And however difficult it may be to explain the genesis of this sense, it can hardly be advanced as an argument for the existence of God, any more than the powerful, though vague and similar feelings excited by music. With respect to immortality, nothing shows me so clearly how strong and almost instinctive a belief it is as the consideration of the view that the sun with all the planets will in time grow too cold for life, unless indeed some great body dashes into the sun and thus gives it fresh life. Believing as I do that man in the distant future will be a far more perfect creature than he is now, it is an intolerable thought that he and all other sentient beings are doomed to complete annihilation after such a long continued slow progress. To those who fully admit the immortality of the human soul, the destruction of our world will not appear so dreadful. It is worthy to note, however, that Darwin did not let even this feeling or prejudice he wished he could believe in immortality, rather envied those who could, but maintained his own doubt. The same is true of his attitude on the problem of conceiving the universe, or the great group of universes as a result of purely impersonal, unintelligent, natural forces. When thus reflecting, he says, I feel compelled to look for a first cause, having an intelligent mind in some degree analogous to conclusion, was strong in my mind about the time, as far as I remember, when I wrote The Origin of Species. And it is since that time, with many fluctuations, become turning pages. Come on now. What was that? Become weaker. But then arises the doubt. Can the mind of man, which has, as I fully believe, been developed from a mind as low as that possessed by the lowest animal, be trusted when it draws such grand conclusions? I cannot pretend to throw the least light on such abstruse problems. The mystery of the beginning of all things is insoluble by us, and I, for one, must be content to remain an agnostic. Such is Darwin's position with relation to the problem of the existence or non-existence of a God. He flatly denies the existence of a personal deity, so far as his belief or knowledge goes, nor does he have any desire to reconcile science and any form of religion, even that of his own country. Science and Christ have nothing to do with each other, except in so far as the habit of scientific investigation makes a man cautious about accepting any proofs. As far as I am concerned, I do not believe that any revelation has ever been made with regard to a future life. Every one must draw his own conclusions from vague and contradictory probabilities. And that's the end of chapter 4. Pardon me. And on to chapter 5. Chapter 5 is titled The Personality of Darwin. Throughout Darwin as a Naturalist, Little Blue Book number 567, in this series, we considered Darwin primarily as a man, a boy, a youth, a father, a friend, as well as a scientist. In the present book, we considered him rather as a worker, a philosopher, a student, and have for the time ignored, or at least slighted, the human side of him. And now, having viewed the more material angles of the man, for even natural philosophy is to a considerable extent material, we may well consider him as a personality, and a personality alone. Just what kind of a man was Charles Darwin? How did he respond to praise and react to opposition? What was there about him that made friends and, on the other hand, occasionally made bitter enemies? How might he have impressed us had we been able to meet him? Appearance, feature, action, and even dress plays a considerable part in personality, even if it serves as little more than a handy index for the casual observer. Darwin's face, however, is too well known to need description, and so we may pass at once to his actions. He was a large man, about 6 feet in height, but looked less because of a stoop which increased much with age. He walked with a loose, swinging step that often was maintained with a good deal of effort, and used a heavy, iron-tipped stick when outside. Indoors, however, his step was often slow and weak, with the feet planted heavily, as though each movement was an effort. When interested in his work, he moved about quickly enough, and often in the middle of dictating, he went eagerly into the hall to get a pinch of snuff, leaving the study door open and calling out the last words of his sentence as he went. In spite of his natural activity and youthful strength, he had throughout his life a clumsiness of movement. His hand was too unsteady and awkward to permit him to make usable drawings, and bothered him much in dissection of small animals and in sectioning plants. When walking, he had a fidgeting movement with his fingers which he has described in one of his books as the habit of an old man. When he sat, he often took hold of one wrist with the other hand. He sat with his legs crossed, and from being so thin, they could be crossed very far, as may be seen in one of the photographs. He had his chair in the study and in the drawing room raised so as to be much higher than ordinary chairs. This was done because sitting on a low or even an ordinary chair caused him some discomfort. The family used to laugh at him for making his tall drawing room chair still higher by putting footstools on it, and then neutralizing the result by resting his feet on another chair. Although his illness prevented Darwin from attending scientific meetings or devoting much time to visits from other workers, he was a capable conversationalist. His son says of him that when he was excited with pleasant talk, his whole manner was wonderfully bright and animated, and his face shared to the full in the general animation. His laugh was a free and sounding peal, like that of a man who gives himself sympathetically and with enjoyment to the person and the thing which have amused him. He often used some sort of gesture with his laugh, lifting up his hands or bringing one down with a slap. I think, generally speaking, he was given to gesture and often used his hands in explaining anything. Pardon me. In a way that seemed rather an aid to himself than to the listener. He did this on occasions when most people would illustrate their explanations by means of a rough pencil sketch. He wore dark clothes of a loose and easy fit. Of late years, he gave up the tall hat even in London, and wore a soft black one in winter and a straw hat in summer. His usual out-of-doors dress was a short cloak, in which Eliot and Fry's photograph represents him leaning against the pillar of the veranda. Two peculiarities of his indoor dress were that he almost always wore a shawl over his shoulders, and that he had great loose cloth boots. He had great loose cloth boots lined with fur, which he could slip on over his indoor shoes. Like most delicate people, he suffered from heat as well as from chilliness. It was as if he could not hit the balance between too hot and too cold. Often a mental cause would make him too hot, so that he would take off his coat if anything went wrong in the course of his work. Such, then, was the appearance of the man who dominated the science of biology for 3 decades. Tall, awkward, eager, and a little eccentric, but without a pose or desire to be singled out from a crowd. His mental attitude was in keeping with his physical. Few men could do more and call less attention to their achievements. Few men so consistently belittled their own virtues and enlarged those of others. Darwin was one of those people who go to extremes in modesty. He refused to admit any special excellence in himself or his work, or to consider that he was above the run of scientific workers. Printed or spoken praise of the material set out in his books pleased him, but extravagant commendation of those books, or praise of himself rather than his work, often caused him actual pain. Even recognition when in public distressed him. He regretted that the abundance of magazine illustrations and photographs made his face known throughout England and Scotland. Even when he went to a water cure establishment for a relief from illness, he could not escape being gazed on, pointed at, and whispered of, as the great Mr. Darwin, who had done many fine things, but who nevertheless held the wicked belief that man was descended from apes and monkeys. This modesty, coupled with an almost boundless generosity, made him almost a patron saint to those younger botanists and zoologists whose work lay in the same channels as his. He would learn of their work and give them praise. He would ask for small favors and reproach himself for causing them so much trouble. Perhaps the next week he would take the work of one of these beginners, edit it, or even rewrite it, and then spread many of his precocious work hours seeing the paper through the whole tedious process of publication. Of course, such acts put the enthusiasm of the younger man at the highest pitch, and gave them confidence in the value of the work that they were doing. They would search their hardest for new facts to record for Darwin, and new specimens to send to him, even from such remote regions as South Africa and India. They felt that they were being of some use in the world of science, and they took long strides forward in the path that leads to achievement. All this does not mean that Darwin was without critical ability, or inclined to accept everything as good. On the other hand, he grasped readily the defects of a piece of work, and resented unfair treatment at the hands of those who had little right to pass judgment. Thus, when the Bishop of Oxford made a brilliant but intolerant address against evolution, and published an article containing the substance of his speech, Darwin wrote, "These very clever men think they can write a review with a very slight knowledge of the book reviewed or the subject in question." Another unfavorable review he characterized as a well-done hash of his own words. Yet even when opposed to the ideas set forth in an article, he retained an even temper, and appreciated whatever of good there might be in the attack. Thus, in speaking of the bishop's criticism, he wrote a friend, "If you have not seen the last quarterly, do get it. The Bishop of Oxford has made capital fun of me and my grandfather." This same freedom from prejudice and ability to exercise his control over his ideas, even when in conflict with his own emotions, is well shown in his attitude toward the anti-vivisectionists. 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 And I think vivisectionists were people who performed surgeries on animals, I think to study their insides and the workings of their insides while they're still alive. Definitely look it up and give me a comment. Tell me what it is. Okay, toward the anti-vivisectionists who wished to prevent experimentation with living animals. There you go. Throughout all of his mature life, Darwin had a horror of bloodshed. Even a slight cut on the hand of one of his youngsters gave him pain. Naturally, the anti-vivisectionist sought to enlist his sympathies, an attempt that was capable of little but harm. To one friend, Darwin wrote, in regard to this case, "It is a subject which makes me sick with horror, so I will not say another word about it, else I shall not sleep tonight." Yet he saw clearly the reason why vivisection is necessary to the science of physiology, and so he took a firm stand against those who would prevent scientists from experimenting with living animals. He was willing to conciliate, to speak as softly as possible in an argument, yet he would not confuse policy and prejudice. He could not fight for his stand because of the limitations imposed by illness, but he was not prevented from holding his own opinions. The constant claims of ill health must have exerted a strong control over Darwin's personality. It prevented him from doing continuous work, yet work was essential for his health and mental balance. So, for the sake of health, all other activities were subordinated to work, while for the sake of the work which would make health possible, his physical condition was watched with endless care and anxiety. In this connection, we may return to a matter touched upon before, Darwin's loss of interest in the arts. It was a matter of great concern to him, and he made much of it in the autobiography. The passage is worth quoting, if only to show what the man thought of himself and how he analyzed his condition. Up to the age of 30, or beyond it, runs the autobiography, poetry of many kinds, such as the works of Milton, Gray, Byron, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Shelley, gave me great pleasure, and even as a schoolboy I took intense delight in Shakespeare. But now, for many years, I cannot endure to read a line of poetry. I have tried lately to read Shakespeare, and found it so intolerably dull that it nauseated me. I have also almost lost my taste for pictures or music. On the other hand, novels, which are works of the imagination, though not of a very high order, have been for years a wonderful relief and pleasure to me, and I often bless all novelists. A surprising number have been read to me, and I like all if moderately good, and if they do not, and unhappily, against which a law ought to be passed. A novel, according to my taste, does not come into the first class unless it contains some person whom one can thoroughly love, and if a pretty woman, all the better. My mind seems to have become a kind of machine for the grinding of general laws out of large collections of facts. By way, this should have caused the atrophy of that part of the brain alone, on which the higher tastes depend, I cannot conceive. A man with a mind more highly organized or better constituted than mine would not, I suppose, have thus suffered. And if I had to live my life again, I would have made a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once every week, for perhaps that part of my brain, now atrophied, would thus have been kept active through use. The loss of these tastes is a loss of happiness, and may possibly be injurious to the intellect, and more probably to the moral character, by enfeebling the emotional part of our nature. It is doubtful if a man ever gave a plainer diagnosis of his own failings than did Darwin in this passage. He does not reproach himself, nor does he make excuses. There are plenty of the latter to be made. The pressure of work, the enthusiasm for things other than the arts, and the constant strain of ill health. As Poulton says, Professor Bradley has spoken of the errors of interpretation due to the reading of Shakespeare with a slack imagination. And any literature worth calling literature demands effort on the part of the reader. Effort was the one thing Darwin could not give. The whole group of factors formed a vicious ring which was bound to exclude everything but work. A ring not very different from that which forms about the average graduate student in our modern colleges. Perhaps, had Darwin never given up literature, it would have required less strain of him in later years. But that he did so was no sign, as he seemed to think, of a mind not highly organized. A little farther on is another piece of self-analysis of equal candor, and perhaps even greater value as substantiating the claim that Darwin, though a great naturalist, was not a genius in the proper sense of the term. He says, "I have no great quickness of apprehension or wit, which is so remarkable in some clever men. For instance, Huxley. I am therefore a poor critic. A paper or book, when first read, generally excites my admiration, and it is only after considerable reflection that I perceive the weak points. My power to follow a long and purely abstract train of thought is very limited, and therefore I could never have succeeded with metaphysics or mathematics. My memory is extensive, yet hazy. It suffices to make me cautious by vaguely telling me that I have observed or read something opposed to the conclusion which I am drawing, or, on the other hand, in favor of it, and after a time I can generally recollect where to search for my authority. So poor in one sense is my memory, that I have never been able to remember more than a few days, a single date, or a line of poetry." Some of my critics have said, "Oh, he is a good observer, but he has no power of reasoning." I do not think that this can be true, for the origin of species is one long argument from the beginning to the end, and has convinced not a few able men. No one could have written it without having some power of reasoning. I have a fair share of invention and of common sense or judgment, such as every fairly successful lawyer or doctor must have, but not, I believe, in any higher degree. Pardon me. On the favorable side of the balance, I think that I am superior to the common run of men in noticing things which easily escape attention, and in observing them carefully. My industry has been nearly as great as it could have been in the observation and collection of facts, which is far more important. My love of natural science has been steady and ardent." This is Darwin's opinion of himself, an opinion so moderate, so obviously made without regard to anyone but himself, and without prejudice on one side nor the other, that one must venture much to disagree with it. Those who will compare the accomplishments of the man with his estimate of himself will see that there is but slight discrepancy. As Carlyle admitted, Charles Darwin was honest and hard-working, and had an unbreakable allegiance to facts. He was not greatly gifted in some respects, and lost some of the gifts which he did possess in youth. On the other hand, he possessed in abundance certain talents which are scanty in the average run of men, and often nearly absent in those of genius. He was a tireless worker, with boundless enthusiasm for his labor. He was patient and fair, willing to see every side of every question, even though it caused delays that ran into years. He had a boundless curiosity along those lines in which he was interested, and an irrepressible desire to theorize. He believed in the efficiency of the human mind to solve great problems, yet he realized only too clearly the errors in which the human mind may fall when it becomes over hasty in drawing conclusions. He worked carefully and honestly, without thought of the cheaper fame or the practical value of his discoveries. As he wrote his old teacher, Henslow, "I believe there exists, and I feel within me, an instinct for truth, or knowledge, or discovery of something the same nature as the instinct of virtue, and that our having such an instinct is reason enough for scientific researches without any practical value ensuing from them." It was in this spirit and with these abilities that Charles Darwin labored, and it was because of them that his labor endured. Comparisons with other men of his own or earlier days are pointless. It makes little difference whether Darwin was greater than Newton or Newton greater than Darwin. What does count is the fact that Darwin was great, and that his work has increased in value and benefit to mankind with the passing of years. Yes, it has. Continues to. And that is the end of Little Blue Book number 568, titled Darwin and the Theory of Evolution, written by Carroll Lane Fenton. Thanks for listening, and join me in the next Little Blue Book.